Ashcombe Hall, the winter of 2009. For 2 years, Duchess Rosalind had been quietly turning the estate into something that belonged to her. Then she decided the late Princess Elaine's bedroom shouldn't look like Elaine's anymore. Prince Julian found out, and he went straight to the Dowager Duchess. What the Dowager Duchess did next, Rosalind never forgot. Ashcombe Hall sits in the countryside, roughly 100 miles from the capital, on land that has belonged to the family for generations. It's where the family gathers every winter holiday, where the annual address to the household staff was first read aloud by candlelight, where generations have spent the quiet weeks between the season's end and the start of the new year, away from the city and everything the city demands of them. For most of the family, it's a beloved place. For Elaine, it was complicated. She hadn't been born in the main house but in a smaller cottage on the grounds, a property her own family had leased for years. She'd grown up within walking distance of Ashcombe Hall, which gave her a connection to the place that existed long before her marriage and had nothing to do with it. But the holidays she spent there as a young wife were an entirely different matter. She found the house cold, literally, given what winters in that part of the country are like, but in every other sense too. The rigid schedules, the formal dinners, the long evenings that moved according to a protocol that left almost no room for anything personal or warm. She told her closest friends she dreaded it. After her marriage ended, she kept bringing her sons to Ashcombe for a few more years. Not because she wanted to be there, but because they did, because it was the holidays and their father would be there, and she wasn't going to be the reason they missed it. She did her best, and the way she managed it was through her room. Over the years, she'd made that one space hers. She'd arranged it exactly as she liked, filled it with the small particular things that make a room feel lived in rather than simply occupied. In a house that felt formal and faintly resistant to her presence, that room was different. It felt like her. Julian knew this. He'd sat in that room with her more times than he could count. He knew which chair she preferred, where she kept things, how the light fell across it in the late afternoon when the sky outside turned that flat winter grey. It was the one place at Ashcombe that still felt entirely like his mother. Rosalind arrived at Ashcombe for the first time as Julian's father's new wife, 8 months after their wedding. On the first day, one of the senior staff members walked her through the house. It was the kind of tour given to someone who was now, officially, mistress of the estate, methodical, respectful room by room. The drawing room, the dining hall, the sitting room where the family gathered on the first night of the holiday, corridors lined with photographs going back generations. At some point they reached the east wing. The staff member paused at a door. "These were the princess's rooms," she said quietly. Rosalind didn't say anything. She pushed the door open and walked in. She stood there a moment, taking in the room, the way it was arranged, the particular details someone had chosen and lived with for years. Then she moved slowly around it, looking at things without touching them, before returning to the doorway and taking one last look. "Lovely," she said, "the way you might describe a guest room in a countryside hotel." Then she moved on. But the staff member who'd been with her that day remembered it afterward, not because of anything Rosalind had said, but because of the way she'd looked at the room. Not with sadness, not with discomfort, with the particular attention of someone filing something away for later. Over the next 2 years, Julian's father and Rosalind visited Ashcombe often, not just for the holidays, but for weekends and summer stays. The ordinary rhythm of people settling into a place and making it their own. Each time, Rosalind moved through the house with growing ease. She learned the staff's names. She developed opinions about the gardens. She began in small ways, leaving her mark on things. And every time she passed the door to the east wing, never said anything about it, but the staff noticed she always slowed just slightly whenever she walked by, a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But they noticed. Then in the winter of 2009, something shifted. It was the holiday season. The whole family was at Ashcombe, Julian's father, Rosalind, Julian, his younger brother, and the Dowager Duchess. The house was full the way it always was that time of year. Everyone under one roof, the same traditions, the same corridors. Rosalind called for one of the senior housekeeping staff and said she wanted changes made to the room. Didn't ask. She had specific ideas, furniture she wanted moved, pieces she wanted replaced, a new arrangement for a room that had belonged to someone else for years and that she now intended to make her own. The staff member listened, nodded, and then went as quickly as she could to find Julian. He was in one of the downstairs rooms reading or trying to. When she found him, she apologized for the interruption. He looked up. "Sorry to bother you," she said, "but there's something I thought you should know." He set down what he was reading. She told him everything, what Rosalind had said, what was being arranged, the furniture, the pieces she wanted gone. Julian went quiet for a moment. "My mother's room," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "When did she ask for this?" "This morning, sir. She was very specific about what she wanted done." He was quiet again, longer this time. Then he thanked her and left the room. He was 24. He'd spent the better part of a decade watching the world process his mother's death in every possible way. The tributes, the documentaries, the endless public conversation about who she'd been and what she'd meant. He'd said very little publicly about any of it. He'd kept what was his to keep. But this was different. He knew exactly what Rosalind was doing, and he knew that she knew he knew. He found her in the drawing room about 20 minutes later. She looked up when he walked in. "Julian?" she said. "Everything all right?" He closed the door behind him. "I just heard about the room," he said. "My mother's room." She held his gaze, perfectly composed. "I've asked for a few changes to be made. The room hasn't been touched in years," she said carefully. "At some point, houses have to belong to the people who actually live in them." He looked at her for a moment. "I'd like you to leave it as it is," he said. She set down what was in her hand. "Julian," she said, her voice careful and measured. "I understand this is difficult, but I'm here now. This is my home too." "And that room was my mother's room," he said. For a second, something tightened visibly in her face, then vanished. She paused. "I know that," she said, "and I have a great deal of respect for it. But things change, people move forward. That isn't disrespect. That's simply how life works." "Not this," he said. She stared at him. "I think perhaps you're being a little—" "No," he said. He said it quietly, but with a finality that stopped her mid-sentence. They looked at each other for a moment. Then she said gently, but without yielding, "I've already spoken to the staff. The preparations are underway." He nodded once and left the room. He stood in the corridor for a moment. The house was quiet around him, that particular stillness Ashcombe had in the afternoons, when the light through the windows turned flat and grey, and the only sounds were distant and domestic. He'd spent every holiday of his life in this house. He knew every corridor, every turn, every room. He knew the one at the end of the east wing especially well. He'd sat in it hundreds of times as a boy, on the bed while his mother read or talked or simply sat in silence the way she sometimes did when the house had been too much, and she needed a few minutes of something that was entirely hers. He remembered the specific quality of that room, the way it felt different from the rest of the house, warmer somehow, more lived in. He remembered thinking, even as a child, that it was the one room at Ashcombe that felt like a place his mother actually wanted to be. He stood there and thought about all of it. Then he went to find the Dowager Duchess. He could have gone to his father instead, but he already knew how that conversation would end. His father would have listened, nodded, and done nothing. Rosalind was his wife. He wasn't going to stand in her way. The Dowager Duchess was different. Ashcombe was hers. It had been hers for decades. Every room, every corridor, every decision about what stayed and what changed. That was ultimately hers to make. No one outranked her in that house. No one. He went straight to her. He found her late in the afternoon. No appointment, no formality, just a knock at the door and a request for a few minutes. "Come in," she said. He sat down and told her what had happened, without much emotion. He'd learned over the years to say difficult things plainly instead of dramatically. He told her what Rosalind had asked the staff to do. He told her he'd spoken to Rosalind directly and that she'd refused to stop. The Dowager Duchess listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Did you speak to her yourself first?" "Yes," he said, and she said no. She said the preparations were already underway. The Dowager Duchess looked at him steadily. "Why does this matter so much to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mother didn't like being here," he said. "She never said it outright. She was careful about that, but we knew. You could tell by the way she carried herself differently here than anywhere else, the way she counted down the days." He paused. But that room was different. She made it hers. It was the one place in this house where she was just herself, where she actually seemed comfortable, where she wanted to be. He looked down at his hands. When I come here now, he said, that room is the only place I can still feel her. The smell, the way things are arranged, the chair she always sat in. It's the only thing left here that's really hers. His voice stayed steady. He'd learned over the years to keep it that way. I'm not asking for much, he said. I'm only asking that the room stay exactly as it is. That's all. The Dowager Duchess said nothing for a long moment. She looked at him, not with pity, not with distance, but with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what was being said and what it had cost him to say it. Leave it with me, she said, and in that house, those words meant something final. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. He left. What happened next took less than an hour. The Dowager Duchess called for the senior housekeeping staff member, the same woman who'd gone to find Julian earlier that day. The woman came and stood the way staff do when they're not quite sure what's coming. The bedroom, the Dowager Duchess said. The princess's room, it's to remain exactly as it is. Nothing is to be moved, replaced, or altered in any way. Whatever preparations were requested are to be undone. She paused. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. The woman left. She went to the others who'd been involved and told them what the Dowager Duchess had said, that the room was to stay as it was, that nothing was to change, that this wasn't open for discussion. They stopped what they'd been doing. They remembered that moment for years afterward. Not because of any drama. There hadn't been any. The Dowager Duchess hadn't raised her voice. But she'd said no to something Rosalind wanted, quietly, without explanation, and the reason had walked out of that room 20 minutes earlier, 24 years old, having done something that took more courage than it looked like from the outside. Rosalind was informed through the appropriate channels that the room wasn't going to change. No explanation was given. She received the news with the same composure she brought to most things and showed no outward reaction. Whether she understood immediately what had happened, who had said what to whom, and why the answer had come back the way it did, no one could say for certain. But she never raised the subject again. The room stayed exactly as it was. Julian has never spoken about this publicly. This particular version of events is, after all, fiction, but the shape of it echoes something true about grief and inheritance and the rooms we can't bear to see changed. In real life, people who've lost someone often talk about the same instinct, the desire to protect a physical space because it's the last place that still smells like the person, still holds the shape of their habits, still feels inhabited by them, instead of just haunted by their absence. The staff who witnessed it, in this story anyway, understood exactly what had occurred. A son had gone to protect his mother's space. He'd tried the direct approach first and been refused. Then he'd gone to the one person in that house whose word was final, and she had listened. There's a particular kind of protection that doesn't announce itself. The Dowager Duchess in this story wasn't a demonstrative woman when it came to her son's late wife. The relationship between them in the world of this story had been complicated and imperfect and never fully resolved. She didn't often speak of her with warmth, but in the quiet way that mattered, she preserved certain things. A room in a house in the countryside, arranged the way someone had left it, untouched. And the room stayed exactly as the princess had left it, because her son had asked, and the one person whose word carried final weight in that house had listened. That's the story. Whether or not anything like it ever happened in any real family, it's the kind of thing that happens more often than people realize, not with dukes and duchesses, but with ordinary families, ordinary rooms, ordinary griefs. Someone leaves, a room stays exactly as it was, and somebody eventually has to decide whether that room gets to stay a memory or gets turned into something else.